morning, everyone. Let's look at consumer theory, specifically the cardinal utility approach. This approach is actually quite old, but it's still very useful because it helps explain how consumers make choice and, more importantly, how we end up with the demand. So don't worry too much about memorizing formula first. Let's focus on the ideas. Let's start with a very basic question. What is utility? Utility refers to the satisfaction or benefit a consumer gets from consuming a good or a service. So, whenever you consume something and it makes you feel better off, that feeling is utility. In other words, satisfaction. Now, under a cardinal utility approach, we make a strong assumption. We assume that this satisfaction or benefit can actually be measured and quantified. To do this, economists use an artificial unit called a util. So the idea is not that utils really exist, but that we pretend to do. So we can say things like, this bundle gives 20 utils, another gives 15 utils. The higher the number of utils, the higher the satisfaction. If you compare this with ordinary utility, you will see the difference clearly. Ordinary utility doesn't try to measure satisfaction numerically. It just ranks preference like saying, I prefer A to B, without saying how much more. Once we accept this idea, we can talk about total utility, or TU. Total utility is simply the total satisfaction a consumer gets from consuming a certain quantity of a good. So, generally speaking, as you consume more units of a commodity, your total utility increases. For example, eating 1 burger gives some satisfaction. Eating 2 burgers gives more total satisfaction. So, total utility is just adding up all the satisfaction from consumption. But economists are usually more interested in marginal utility, or MU. Marginal utility refers to the additional utility or additional satisfaction gained from consuming one more unit of a good. Another way to say this, marginal utility tells us how much total utility changes when quantity increases by 1 unit. In mathematical terms, MU is the change in total utility divided by the change in quantity consumed, and graphically is the slope of the total utility curve. This idea of marginal utility is very important because it leads directly to the law of diminishing marginal utility. Before moving on, there is one more assumption we need to mention. Under the cardinal utility approach, the consumer is assumed to be rational. This means the consumer tries to use limited income to achieve the highest possible satisfaction or benefit. Of course, in real life, people are not always perfectly rational, but this assumption helps keep the theory simple. Now let's connect total utility and marginal utility. The relationship between them is explained by the law of diminishing marginal utility. As consumption increases, marginal utility tends to decrease. However, as long as marginal utility is still positive, total utility will continue to increase just at a decreasing rate. When marginal utility becomes zero, total utility reaches maximum point, which we call saturation point. If consumption continues beyond the point, marginal utility becomes negative and total utility starts to fall. If you look at the table and curve on the slide, you can see this clearly. From 1 to 6 units, total utility rises from 10 to 30, while marginal utility keeps falling. At the 7th unit, marginal utility becomes negative and total utility declines. So basically, marginal utility tells us what happens to total utility. Now let's focus more on the law of diminishing marginal utility itself. This law states that over a given period of time, as a consumer consumes more units of a commodity in succession, the additional utility or marginal utility from each extra unit will decline. The intuition is very simple. The consumer uses the first unit to satisfy the most urgent want. Later units are used to satisfy less important wants. In simple terms, the more you already have of something, the less additional satisfaction or benefit you get from one more unit. A classic example is pizza. The first slice gives very high marginal utility, but by the seventh slice, the extra satisfaction is much lower. For this law to hold, several conditions must be met. First, the commodity must be consumed in standard units. Second, consumer taste must remain constant. Third, consumption must be continuous. And last, the consumer must be in a normal state of mind. Now let's move on to consumer equilibrium. Consumer equilibrium refers to the situation where a consumer achieves a maximum satisfaction given limited income. At this point, the consumer cannot rearrange spending to obtain more utility. We usually analyze consumer equilibrium in two cases, with a single commodity and with multiple commodities. Let's start with the simple case. When a consumer is consuming only one good, equilibrium is reached when the marginal utility of the last unit consumed equals the price of the good. So the condition is MUX equal to PX. If MUX is greater than PX, the consumer is getting more satisfaction or benefit than the price paid, so consumption will increase. If MUX is less than PX, the consumer is paying more than the satisfaction received, so consumption will decrease. Consumption adjusts until MUX equal to PX, and that's where equilibrium is achieved. Now, if the consumer is consuming more than one good, the logic is similar, but slightly extended. In this case, equilibrium is reached when the marginal utility per dollar spent on all goods is equal. If one good gives higher marginal utility per dollar than another, the consumer will spend more on that good and less on the other. As consumption changes, marginal utilities change as well. This continues until the marginal utility per dollar spent is equal across all goods. At that point, total utility is maximized and the consumer is in equilibrium, assuming all income is spent. Now, this is where the cardinal utility approach links directly to the law of demand. Marshall used the idea of diminishing marginal utility and consumer equilibrium to derive the law of demand. When the price of goods falls, the marginal utility per dollar spent on that good increases, and the consumer is no longer in equilibrium. To restore equilibrium, the consumer buys more of the cheaper good. As consumption increases, marginal utility falls due to the law of diminishing marginal utility until equilibrium is restored again. This explains the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. When price falls, quantity demanded rises. When price rises, quantity demanded falls. As a result, the rebound curve slows downward. The relationship is also supported by the substitution effect and the income effect. Even though this approach is useful, it has several limitations. First, utility is subjective, so it cannot be measured precisely in numerical units. Second, the marginal utility of money is not constant because the value of money differs across individual and income levels. Third, the theory relies heavily on the ceteris paribus assumption, ignoring change in income and substitution effects when price changes. Finally, there is little empirical evidence to directly prove the law of diminishing marginal utility. When the price of goods changes, the change in quantity demanded can be explained by two effects. The substitution effect happens because the good becomes relatively cheaper or more expensive compared to other goods, so consumers substitute toward the cheaper option. The income effect happens because a price change affects real purchasing power. When price falls, consumers feel richer. When price rises, consumers feel poorer. For normal goods, higher real income leads to higher quantity demanded. For inferior goods, higher real incomes leads to lower quantity demanded. Finally, let's briefly touch on behavioral economics. Behavioral economics combine economics with psychology and show that consumers do not always behave in a perfectly rational way. For example, consumers often ignore non-monetary opportunities costs, show that endowment effect, and fail to ignore some costs. This behavior highlights the limitation of the cardinal utility approach in explaining real-world decision-making. So overall, even though the cardinal utility approach has clear limitations, but it provides a structured way to understand consumer behavior and the derivation of the law demand.